So I think a good place to start is why don't you tell us how you got involved in researching cannabinoids in athletics?
Yeah, for sure. So it was not a linear path, as I don't think anybody's ever really is. But my undergraduate degree is in molecular biology, and then I have a master's degree in applied physiology. And I was always athletic, and so with my physiology degree, we were always looking at training principles or just basically principles of physiology of how can you really push the human body to do things that you want it to do essentially using non-pharmacological agents. So looking at, training principles or nutrition or even supplementation, whatever. So I worked with athletes and I also worked clinically. So I had a patient population. But the biggest driving factor behind it was my husband's actually was an athlete, a professional athlete. And we've been together since we were 17 years old, and I would watch him play and I was like, man, this is not going to end well if you keep
Mhm.
on the head contact and the contact and the contact. And so just knowing, having a background really of molecular mechanisms and understanding what was happening all the time, I started to really look for ways to reduce the neural inflammation, just thinking like, I don't want to be feeding you with a straw when we're 80 years old. So let's see what we can do. There's got to be things. And there are a lot of things you can do, which is the empowering part about understanding physiology is there's a ton that you can do to really help support your system to reduce those things. And so um, I started looking specifically. So when he was playing, really was in the 2000s. So I'll date myself here, but it was really the height of the opioid epidemics in athletics. Like there was a lot of exposure of opioids, and we had teammates that ended up with opioid problems. We buried some teammates, and I was like, there has to be something better than this. And so in order to understand that, I wanted to understand the mechanisms of how opioids worked. And so I started to look at the molecular mechanisms in the brain of how opioids were actually working and physiologically, like why are people, how does it kill you? What is happening here? And so I came across research that suggested that using cannabinoids, you could actually reduce the required amount of opioids to have the same pain efficacy. And I was thinking, like, that's crazy. How would that even work? And I didn't really know anything about cannabis at all. I mean, I was a downhill ski racer and I played rugby. I was always like, an endorphin junkie. And so we understood cannabis from like a recreational cultural standpoint. I grew up in Canada, it's always around, but I didn't really understand anything about the molecular mechanisms, which was shocking because I'd already finished 2 degrees that were focusing on molecular mechanisms. And I had never seen anything about the endocannabinoid system. So, anyways, I started looking at that and I kind of went down a rabbit hole, and I have been there for probably the last 10 or 15 years, just looking at the different ways that the endocannabinoid system can work. Really in neural inflammation, but it really goes everywhere throughout your whole body. And so it was looking at things like that. And so then I applied to, I thought, okay, well, I think that I saw the mechanism that I really wanted to look at, and it was the calcium channel. So just getting like super nerdy here, but it was the calcium channels in the neurons. And I thought, well, like who's looking at this? And so I looked for any supervisor anywhere that was actually studying that. And of course, after having a couple people tell you you're totally crazy because it's like, hey, have you ever looked at using cannabis to reduce neuroinflammation? And most people are like, yeah, okay, next. I don't know what you're talking about. But my supervisor now, he he was one of the first people. It was like the only paper that I actually found at that time that was published specifically talking about some of the cytokines and chemokines that happen, when you have neuroinflammation and the potential for maybe some things that cannabinoids could do to reduce those. And so I contacted him, and he knew exactly what I was talking about. And so I was like so thrilled. And so I thought I was going to have to beg him to take me on as a graduate student, but he said, oh yeah, like I would love to have you. And so um, I applied. And so I wanted to look at concussion specifically. It was concussion and neuroinflammation in the brain. And, he was happy to do that. And right after that, we saw the call from the NFL. I was actually outside watering my first cannabis plant that I ever grew, and it was in 2021, and it came across my phone and I was like, Patrick, check it out, like the NFL is actually putting up money to study the thing that I just said, like I that's what we want to look at. And so I didn't really think we would apply. I thought that he'd be like, hey, cool, like we're not crazy, we're this
Mhm.
is not some, people think that yes, someone else thinks this. And so he was, but instead he was like, okay, yeah, we're gonna apply. And so he went and he gathered, and he's wonderful, so he gathered people that he had worked with over the course of his career to look at, like, we're looking at so many different metrics, but we had to put in for, it was an NIH adjudication to go through, all the different researchers that applied for the funding. And we were selected as the group that the NFL would fund to look at all the different metrics for using cannabinoids for neuroinflammation, concussion, pain, and then opioid sparing. So he's my one supervisor that took me on, and then I'm actually double supervised. My other supervisor is the dean of pharmacy. So my PhD is in pharmacy at the University of Saskatchewan. So those two are my supervisors. And we have a team, an amazing team of people that are looking at so many different metrics of, how we can use cannabinoids to potentially reduce some of the things, So for me, it's very personal. I have people in my life, like, we are surrounded by athletes. I grew up in sports, and you can only change so many rules and redesign a helmet and a mouth guard
Mm.
so many ways. But unless you're actually focusing on the molecular things inside the skull, you're missing a massive opportunity to do something that I believe, we need the data, and that's why we're
Yep.
getting it, to prove that what we believe to be true is actually happening in humans. And we have a ton of preclinical, there's a ton of animal models that show it, but because of the laws and the prohibition and the inability for researchers to put this substance in a human and actually draw data, which in Canada now is even doubly ridiculous because people can walk down the street and buy it anywhere they want. And it's
Mm.
still actually very hard to do research in
Oh,
Canada,
wow.
even though at the federal level, it's legal. We've been legal there since 2018. And so it's accessible to anybody in our country that's over the legal age. But to do research was actually still very difficult. And that's why it's taken us so long. That was in 2021, and we just finished the first portion of the clinical trial. So it's, yeah, I mean, I feel like there'd be a lot more human data if
Hmm.
the policies would have allowed researchers to do the research that they've been trying to do for a really long time.